Hello and welcome to Viking.TV. My name is Damon Stanwell-Smith. I'm the Head of Science and Sustainability here at Viking. And today I'm very much looking forward to a conversation with David McGonigal. David is an author. He is a journalist. He is, as you'll find out, a remarkable adventurer and, most pertinently to Vikings' travel to the Deep South, a very experienced Antarctician. So welcome, David, to Viking TV. Looking forward to finding more about your remarkable career.
Thanks, Damon. It's nice to be here.
Well, may I start by there are many things associated with adventure travel, and many of our viewers will be thinking about this, perhaps if going to the Antarctic, in particular the Southern Ocean. And I understand there's a remarkable statistic in your career, which, when I think about it, is well worth asking you more about. And that is, I understand that you've spent more than 2 years of your life in the Drake Passage. Please do share how that has come about.
I started just doing the maths for how it worked out, but when you've been to Antarctica around about 130 times, and I know the Viking vessels are a lot faster, but the regular trip used to be 2 days each way, so that's 4 days for 130, and a lot of those voyages, probably about 50% of them, were to South Georgia, which includes more sea time, so more time in the Drake, and it worked out that it was over 2 years just on the Drake. And then everyone always says, how do you find it? And I said, normally I reckon about 70% of the time it's a bit rolly, and on a Viking ship they won't even be noticing it. Still stemmed wine glasses at dinner. And then there's probably about 15% when you get the Drake Lake, when you're taking photos of yourself in the water off the bow with the reflections. And then there's about 15% when you get the Drake Shake. And the Drake Shake's never, it can be enjoyable. It's an experience.
Well, I think that, in my limited experience over the years of traveling down, talking with guests that are traveling with me, when it's the Drake Lake, people are a little bit disappointed secretly.
I think so too. Everyone wants to experience the Drake. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And it sounds like, what an opening. And I mentioned in my opening remarks about being an Antarctician. This is possibly a term that not every Viking guest and the Viking viewer might have heard. But as an author of 3 books about the Antarctic, which are very sort of much the definitive for understanding the space, how would you describe being an Antarctician? Indeed, do you identify as that? Have I embarrassed you in calling you that?
No, I think I probably have claimed that for quite a while, but I think it's those people who fall in love with every aspect of Antarctica and just want to know more and more about it, and ideally go down there more and more often. But you do establish this deep enthusiasm for everything about Antarctica, and there's nothing you enjoy more than going in in great depth, so that when I'm giving a talk on Sir Ernest Shackleton, I always ask if there's anyone who's a member of the James Caird Society, because that's a society that just looks at the open boat voyage that Crean and Worsley and Shackleton and the other 3 men took from Elephant Island to South Georgia. And there's actually a society that only discusses that. So there's the level of in-depth enthusiasm about everything. I always find awe-inspiring, and I'd love to be part of it.
Well, that's fantastic. And I know your books are very well read and very much appreciated by the Antarctic traveling community. I understand that you've had some pretty well-known appreciators of your work.
Yes, I have indeed. Antarctica, The Complete Story, which was the first and the most comprehensive of my books on Antarctica. A few years after that was released, I met Princess Anne, who was down there as the patron of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, and she was at Deception Island when I was there. A friend of mine, a mutual friend, so he introduced me to Princess Anne, and I was just about to say who I was, and she went, David McGonigal, your book is the only book on the bridge of HMS Endurance. And ever since, I just wish I had a camera running when she said that, but I don't.
Well, it's nice to be appreciated by if there's many authors, but if there's only one on the HMS Endurance, that's a good measure, and especially if it's a if it's coming from an Australian colleague, I think that's doubly telling a point about HMS Endurance. I find that's fantastic.
Yes.
And I understand also that you came to Antarctic travel sort of mid-career. What was the driver that took you down to Antarctica in the first place?
Oh, goodness. Yes, I did. My first time in Antarctica, I was 44 when I studied arts and law at Sydney University. And when I was going through law school, I actually wrote to the Antarctic division and asked if I could have a job. They asked me what I was studying. This is all by letter too, back in these days. And I wrote back and said, I'm studying law. And they effectively said, look, get back to us when you know something useful. And I had the joy of telling Dr. Phil Law, who followed Douglas Mawson in to set up the Australian Antarctic division, that story when I'd done probably by then about 20 or so voyages to Antarctica. So I did finally get down there. But from an Australian point of view, because it's, as you know, it's a hot, dry continent, and I was 17 before I saw snow for the first time. People say I have overcompensated since, but not having even seen snow, Antarctica was such an exotic concept. I couldn't believe it existed. And even as a schoolboy reading Jack London books about the call of the wild, and there's snowdrifts and snow falling and wolves around and things like that. It was incomprehensible to someone who only just had to jump on his bicycle and ride out of town to see kangaroos hopping around to imagine this completely different world. And I fell in love with it. Fell in love with the concept of it. And then when I did get to Antarctica, I found that all my imagination had just touched the surface of just what a rich, amazing place it was. And so my first trip to Antarctica gave me what has proved to be a deep, abiding love.
But David, you mentioned about how you got to Antarctica, and we mentioned a moment ago about the James Caird, small open boat with Shackleton and colleagues in that amazing rescue during the sort of time around World War One. But you also got to Antarctica on unusual means, I understand.
I did indeed. I had been to Antarctica once before. I went down as a journalist to write a story for the Sydney Morning Herald on an icebreaker down to East Antarctica, and it was just the most amazing experience. As you'd imagine, I came back, I was full of enthusiasm for it. And then a couple of years later, I decided I was going to do what was going to be a second motorcycle ride around the world. And the first time I'd just done the usual kind of hippie trail across Asia. And I thought, so maybe this next time I should actually be more comprehensive. And I decided, it was a wet afternoon. I had maps out all over the lounge room floor, and I came up with the idea of doing the world's first 7-continent, all-time zone motorcycle ride. And if you're doing all 7 continents, you have to actually get to Antarctica. And so I did.
That's fantastic. And you also, you just in your conversation a moment ago, you mentioned you just did the usual ride around the world on a motorcycle, which I'm very envious of as a motorcyclist myself, but not nearly as adventurous as you. I'm guessing that was at a time when travel was a little different to the modern way with trackers and the internet and everyone knowing where you are and blogging and what have you. How was that setting your course in terms of your adventure side of your career?
Yeah, that was kind of in a line I've used far too many times. I ran away from Sydney, the legal profession, and my girlfriend at the time, but not necessarily in that order. I jumped on a motorcycle about a year after leaving law school, and from 1976 to 1979, I rode a rattly old 2-stroke Yamaha RD 350 around the world. And by the time I came back, I was a travel writer, but the writing back then, as you say, was such a completely different experience from now, because now if you don't post something on Instagram every day, your family's wondering where you're up to. And on that trip, the only way I had contact with home, because it was too expensive to call home when you could, so it was all letters or aerograms, if anyone remembers those. And you'd pick them up at Post Restaurant. So you'd go into a strange town. I remember Kathmandu, going into Post Restaurant, joining the line. I think it's called General Delivery in the US, but and I went there and asked if there's any mail for me, and they came back with a great wad of about 50 letters, and then you'd just go and have an orgy of reading all these letters to find out what had been happening in the month or more since you were last at the previous Post Restaurant. And that's the way you went around the world. And in fact, on the long ride between Kathmandu and Iran, my grandmother died. And it was 3 months later, when I arrived in Tehran, that I got the aerogram from my mother to say that my grandmother had died at that stage 3 months before. But they had no way of telling me. I had no way of finding out. And it was the same with money. It wasn't a matter of just kind of sticking your card in a hole in the wall. That was kind of traveling with traveler's checks. I think I still have $100 American Express traveler's check somewhere. That was the last one I haven't cashed. And the fact that now it's all Instagram, you're on the internet. So basically you wake up in the morning, you check, you may even listen to the news from your hometown before you set off on the day. And back then it was, when you left home, it really was leaving home, and I think you could actually define who you wanted to be. If you wanted to be a whole new person, and you hit the road and you became that new person. It was just an amazing experience, and I loved every minute of that kind of discovery of myself and the world.
I can imagine it. It is life defining, isn't it, to have that level of self-sufficiency. And on the road, I recall a recent Viking.TV interview was with the co-founder of Lonely Planet, Tony Wheeler, who's quite the legend in the kind of travel that you're describing, and my own travels as a teenager with the same, following in the Lonely Planet books and following Post Restaurants and so on in the 80s, like you're describing. I believe that your paths have crossed.
Not physically, but in locations, definitely. So Tony and Maureen were a few years ahead of me. And I wish I'd had the foresight to actually write. I could have almost got my book out, but I probably wouldn't have come up with a title as good as Lonely Planet, even though, as he told Viking.TV, that wasn't what the name should have been, which was a great story too. So I suggest everyone find that Viking.TV episode, but please wait till the end of this one before you do. And it was just a great story. But we went across, I was traveling with a mate of mine, Trevor, and we went across central Afghanistan. We got to possibly the most remote place now on the planet, which is the Minaret of Jam, which is in this little valley, right, if you put a dot in the center of Afghanistan, you'd get it there. And we got to the Minaret of Jam, and it had just been a hell of a ride. Literally, we're riding the bikes through creeks. There was no road, so you just followed the creek bed down. And I was at a talk of, I was having at a conference, a travel writers conference, and Tony was the guest speaker there, and he mentioned that he and Maureen had got to this really isolated place called the Minaret of Jam. And then afterwards, over drinks, I came up and said, "You too?" And he said, "What?" And I said, "The Minaret of Jam." And he said, "Have you been there?" He said, "I've never met anyone else that's ever been there." And I said, "Neither have I." So we kind of bonded completely over the fact that there was this obscure place that both of us had got to. And it actually gave me, we'd all read the Lonely Planet books. We mainly read about the big cities that we're all kind of going through. But then it gave me even more respect for Tony and Maureen, that they hadn't just done the standard route through Afghanistan as it then was. They'd actually followed the caravanserai trails effectively across central Afghanistan, and which had led them to this most obscure place, the Minaret of Jam.
Oh, I love it. It's fantastic. And it's and you mentioned, I mean, this by definition, I suppose, made you a travel writer. Although I suspect there's much more than just writing down your travels to be able to share and emote and communicate the space. Over your career as a travel writer, do you have particular highlights that jump out?
Oh, uh, I guess it's the nature of the definition of the career that there are. So I went to Bhutan in the very early days when it was very much, I think, restricted to 3,000 visitors a year. And Bhutan's just an amazing place that I think everyone should get to. I hitchhiked across Tibet when Tibet first opened up to foreign travelers and you could travel independently. But the hitchhiking across Tibet, I actually hitchhiked to Everest Base Camp on the Chinese side. But there, not only were there no hotels, there was no transport, there was no anything. So I ended up walking a lot of it, drinking water from stagnant ponds. I had 3 tins of canned peaches to get me through the trip. And eventually really only survived because I got a lift with a Chinese army truck that was heading down to the border. And he, even though he shouldn't have picked me up, he did pick me up, which I'm eternally grateful for. But it's also the people you meet along the way. And as a journalist, you have that incredible privilege of being able to talk to people that you wouldn't talk to any other way. So one of the most memorable of those was Sam Phillips, who discovered Elvis Presley. I had asked for an interview with him. They said he wasn't available. Then when I arrived in Memphis, they said, "Oh, Sam's just called to say that the TV interview he's meant to be doing has been cancelled. So if I drive you over there, he can see you now." And we spent about 2 hours just talking through literally the foundation of rock and roll and hearing his stories. And he was so remarkably frank and telling stories about Roy Orbison sending him a wire recording, and if you remember when they could put recordings on a kind of a spool of wire, and he played it back, and he said even with a tinny sound, he could actually hear Roy Orbison's. The tape he sent was Ooby Dooby, and he said I could hear that voice. And when Roy called me back, I said, "Jump on a train. I'd love to see you over here." And he ended up at Sun Studios, of course. And the big bit, probably with the Sam Phillips one, the big one was I got to ask Sam. The story was always that Elvis was in recording a song for his mother for her birthday, but he actually did it about 5 months before his mother's birthday. And I said, "Was that story true?" And he said, "No, it wasn't." He said, "I used to watch Elvis in that furniture delivery van driving up and down our street trying to get the nerve to come in and ask if I'd record him," which was amazing. And if you think that's a highlight, because it absolutely was, I had the honor and privilege of having a personal audience with the Dalai Lama and just sat down and could ask him any questions. Well, literally any question I wanted to. In fact, his personal secretary, because I went up the day before and introduced myself and said I was in town and ready to do it. And he said, "Oh, first I should talk to you about your questions." And I thought, here it comes. Don't talk about this or that, and, be a bit diplomatic. He said, "Oh, of course you can ask His Holiness whatever you like." He said, "But try not to ask normal, boring questions, will you?" And so we did it. I came up with all sorts of questions, and we discussed overcrowding on the planet, the ethics of scientific research. We went into all sorts of amazingly deep things, which was just, and you meet so many, as a journalist, you do meet a lot of famous people. And he was the one that I came away thinking, this is just this incredible conjunction of spirituality, common sense and curiosity that he combines. And he pulls it together into a worldview where you could ask him anything and he will give you an answer that will surprise you and will have a depth that you had never thought of before. He's an amazing man.
Well, it's incredible. And I mean, the principle of how many degrees separation. By meeting personally Dalai Lama, I suspect you have 2 degrees of separation of pretty much everybody else of note in the world. So,
probably indeed.
Oh, and I think your point's well taken about these incredible adventures that you've had. It's the people. It's like looking at photographs, isn't it? When you look at old photographs of just a view, it's not quite the same as an old photo with a human in it, the person you met, the story that tells, and the memories that you have. And I'm mindful that as well as these travels and the travel writing and all the meeting, that you've actually you unlike so many in conversations about genuine being an adventurer, I understand that you've had some really big adventures as well.
Uh,
Would you be
I
care
had
to share with us just a few snippets of the more out there things that you've been involved with?
I'll probably do a kind of an uplifting one and another one. And the uplifting one would be when I came back from my first motorcycle ride around the world. I found all the guys that I'd been racing motorcycles with had gone into gliding or soaring. And so I got into it too. And I was part of a team that set an Australian height record where I took a tiny little two-seater fiberglass glider to 29,500 feet over Mount Kosciuszko on the snowy mountains. And I was the marker boy for someone who came in over the top of me and then set the Australian height record. He had a different oxygen system, so he could do that. And that was just an amazing thing to do. And I'm also a scuba diver, and that's kind of the other way around. That I found as a scuba diver and a travel writer, every time I went somewhere, they'd always say, "Oh, David, you're here. You're only here for a day. We have to show you the absolute best, and so let's do this incredibly deep, really challenging dive, whether it's kind of hanging onto rocks against the current with hammerheads overhead in the Galapagos, or diving really deeply on the President Coolidge in Vanuatu." And I found that I wasn't diving enough, and my confidence kind of went. I thought I don't really want to go places and feel that I'm really pushing myself in terms of my understanding and training. And so I've kind of gone to, occasionally I go diving, but if I do, it's kind of very kind of shallow. Let me take me down to a little coral grotto and have a look at it. I don't need to do the really challenging dives anymore, but gliding still remains an enduring love.
Oh, that's fantastic. And as you say about scuba diving, in my experience with diving, the older you get, the more you appreciate snorkeling. It's in terms of the amount of with equipment and everything else.
Yes.
And you mentioned earlier you did more than one world voyage with motorcycles. So you have your early adventures with Precious Storms and the solace of discovery. What motivated you to go around a second time?
There was so much more I needed to do. I'd kind of literally only done very much the kind of standard hippie trail across Asia, as I said, and this time I thought I'd like to do it in more depth and actually achieve something which would be a world first, which was the world's first 7-continent and all 24 time zone. And obviously the logistics of getting a bike to Antarctica, well, now it's impossible. So effectively, I guess you could fly one in if you want to go through the permit process. But back then things were a bit more kind of cowboy almost. And I was given permission to take my motorcycle down. We put it on an old Russian research vessel. It was the only thing in the hold of the vessel. So I could imagine it being bounced from one side of the hold to the other the whole way across the Drake. But they gave me some straps, and there was a huge collection of 128 rolls of toilet paper. And so I actually strapped toilet paper to the pole and the bikes to the toilet paper. There are more toilet paper on the outside, and kind of wound it all together in some remarkable sculpture, I guess. And it survived, and I got it down there. I wanted to land on Antarctica itself, not one of the islands. And so the best place to do that was right at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula is a Argentinian base called Esperanza. And we called the base commander and said, "Can we come ashore?" And back then it was a lot less formal than it is now. And he said, "Yeah, you're welcome, come ashore." And the expedition leader said, "Oh, do you mind if we bring a motorcycle in too?" And he said, "Nah, why not?" He did neglect to mention that there was a 2-meter ice slip that we were going to have to lug the bike up. But then I actually took the bike for a ride around the base as you'll see some photos, I hope, in this. It was gravel tracks, so I wasn't doing any damage to Antarctica. I rode perhaps 2 kilometers on that large continent, so it was really just kind of touching the edges of what you could do in Antarctica. But it was just a great thing to do. It was the day after my birthday, so it was kind of an extra highlight to have landed my bike in Antarctica. But that was that only got one of the continents in. It was literally there's a very boring photo of my motorcycle riding down a ramp off a ferry, and that was when it actually rode. I'd just come from Europe across to Africa, out of Gibraltar and across to Morocco, and that was the minute that my motorcycle touched the seventh continent and became, and it's very much an historic artifact. And I just gave him a camera to one of the dock workers, and he got the horizon perfectly level. So I hope he's gone on to a great career as a photographer. Yes. Because he deserves to.
Yeah. So, well, no, as you say, it's you took the same bike to all the places, isn't it? I suppose it's more than just going to the Antarctic with a bike. You corral that motorcycle to everywhere, to all continents. It's fantastic.
So yes, so Damon, that bike actually, I still have it. I still ride it. It's now I think it's vintage or veteran. I'm not sure which, but I still ride it. It's still got some of the stickers on it. Some of them have actually come off. And
well,
it was
it's an Echo BMW. It's probably just about run in now, isn't it?
Yes, it hasn't done as many miles since the ride as it did on the ride, but it's very much kind of part of me, and I love it. Every time I hop on it, I just kind of think about all the countries that I have hopped on the bike. And then probably one tale, if I've got time to tell, was the Guinness Book of Records, which I didn't actually end up applying for membership because they didn't have any category for people who'd done 7 continent rides. They said, oh, we've got a category for 6 continent. And I said, well, I've done 7. So anyway, I didn't engage in that, but they actually require you to go to contrapuntal points on the Earth's surface, which is basically if you stuck a knitting needle through a globe, where would you be on the other side when you came out? And it's really interesting to look at that because there's very few places where there's land on both sides. So when you're in one place, there's ocean on the other. The Pacific, of course, blocks out a whole bunch of it. But to get the last of my time zones, I've done a kind of whip around the Pacific on a tramp steamer, and I had lots of time to look at maps, and I worked out that the contrapuntal points I could go to is I'd stayed in the Novotel Hotel in Madrid, and there was a tiny little village north of Wellington in New Zealand called Mangatiti, I think it was, and that was the contrapuntal point. And so when I got to Wellington, I rode up the road. I had my GPS. I knew exactly the coordinates I was after, and I went down a road, then down a track, and then finally I was just on kind of a farm lane, and I had to open a farm gate and drive in, and my bike was exactly opposite where the car park in Madrid had been. And not surprisingly, someone came out of the farmhouse about 200 meters away, and he wandered over and he said, "Can I ask what you're doing, mate?" And I said, "Contrapuntal points," explained it all to him. He said, "Oh, okay." And I said, "Look, I'm sorry if it's a problem, but, I just had to get here." And he said, "No," he said, "we had another motorcyclist here last week." And I said, He must have stayed at the Novotel in Madrid and worked out exactly the same as me. So if you after that kind of serendipitous coincidences,
absolutely,
I had no idea who it was.
You think about the globe with so much water, there must be relatively few points, except maybe north to south, and even then, I guess there's finding those contrapuntal points. That's a new word on me as well. So every day is a school day.
There you go.
And talking north and south, if we were to steer south again, and of course you, in order to spend 2 years in the Drake Passage, you've been to Antarctica many times. You were soon back in the Antarctic, I understand.
Yes. There was those few years during COVID where I didn't get to Antarctica. And then I'm very grateful to Viking that I came back as a historian and Zodiac driver, because my love is driving Zodiacs. But anyway, so I came back to Antarctica as an historian, and we actually came down onto the peninsula on the afternoon of our second sea day, and I was just surrounded by the glaciers, and there was that I was in the World Cafe. I get very fittingly named World Cafe, and I looked outside, saw kind of my home of the last 25 years again. There was just this huge sigh of satisfaction to think I'm back, and it's still just as remarkable as it always has been. And I think I'm going to be coming back and giving some more talks, I hope.
Oh, well, we're delighted that
year.
you're returning. I mean, that's fantastic, and of course, much of your time down south has been in a leadership role. I understand that you've been an expedition leader on many voyages. How does that compared to maybe being a historian and a Zodiac driver and so on?
Well, it's kind of full circle because I started off as a photographer and historian. And then after a few full seasons, like literally going down in November and coming back in March, I always said by the time you knew enough to be an expedition leader, you knew why you didn't want the job. But about 3 years later, I said, look, I really want to lead. And then I did that for the next 20 years. Yes, everything is very much on your shoulders. You're the one that has to make it work. There could not be an easier job in the world than making people fall in love with Antarctica. So there's all the logistics and all the rest of it, but there's also that incredible level of satisfaction that when people are heading back towards Ushuaia and just everyone's smiling, everyone's looking at their photos, everyone's talking to each other about the amazing experiences, and you just know that so many people have had their lives changed by what you've done. So being an expedition leader in Antarctica has got to be about the most rewarding job in the world. But I think that I'm ready to kind of move back to a secondary role. The hours for EL, like the lack of sleep over the course of a season, is no longer for me. I don't think I can do the make sure I'm up by 5 o'clock just to see what the conditions are like, and then hopefully I can be in bed before midnight to get ready for the next day. I think I'd prefer to maybe be in the bar talking about Shackleton.
Well, I mean, you're right. It's a very responsible role, and in my own experience of being in EL in the past, being responsible, if you like, the narrative arc of a voyage. So going with the guests as well as all the management of safety and risk and so on. And I can imagine with your background that must have chimed well with your storytelling expertise as well as all the risk management and adventure side as well. And
it all, yeah. If I could just say on that, it always is about risk management, but the systems are so well in place to make sure that everyone does stay safe. So I've always said that my life has been trying to do dangerous things as safely as possible, and I find working in Antarctica, and specifically, I have to say, working with Viking, there's a level of making sure that the systems are designed so that people can do things as safely as they possibly can. And occasionally things are going to challenge that, but there's a system in place to deal with how that comes about and to make sure that everyone is kept safe. And you at the end of a season, there's just that huge, we did it. We've had another however many hundreds or thousands of people come down and then go home to tell the stories about how amazing Antarctica is.
No, I agree. Count them out, count them back. And to paraphrase Roald Amundsen, adventure is just bad planning. I believe it's something one of his. That's somewhere in that.
He did say we enjoy it when it happens, but we never seek it out. Yeah.
Well, it's the pragmatic approach. And with all your travel in the Antarctic, what's the most common question that you're asked by the guests that you've taken?
I'd say there's two questions. The first, the easy one to answer is kind of, when's the best time to go down? And then I have to say, well, summer, because unless you want to bring a flashlight, it's not going to work any other time. But I also say that the summer months are so intense that you can literally, you have to work out what your priorities are. The start of the season is that beautiful, pristine, snow-covered landscape. And then by December and Christmas, you've got the penguins have got chicks, and then you've got the chicks molting in January, and then by mid-January you've got the whales have kind of been down there long enough that they've fed well enough and they're ready to kind of see what else is on, and they often curious about zodiacs, and so the end of the season is very much about that kind of abundance of humpback whales kind of being curious about us. And so you really have to work out where in that continuum you want to visit. So I say it's not a matter of saying there is a time. I've also not, I presume you'd agree with this, that I've been down when, because people think that the fringe, the start or the end is going to be the worst weather. And I've had perfect weather start and end, and it's just not been good for a month or so in the middle, which is the peak time when everyone thinks this is peak summer, so this should be the best. And the other question I always get asked about is, do I see any signs of global warming? And again, I say that having been to Antarctica for so many summers, I'm conscious that sometimes you have a cold summer, sometimes you have a warm summer, so you can't say, oh, it's getting colder, so every summer is going to be more and more cold or warm or whatever. So you're really looking at changing landscapes. And in terms of the ice, particularly up around South Georgia, you can see how the ice is deteriorating. But it's mainly penguin populations. And I always go to a place called Peterman Island, because Peterman, when Charcot was there in the early 1900s, was nearly all Adelie penguins. They're cold weather penguins. When I started going there in the 90s, it was mainly Adelies with some Gentoos. And now it's very much majority are Gentoos, which are warm weather penguins. And some researchers have actually been there and they've seen Gentoos just basically tossing Adelies out of their nests, saying it's time for you to move on. And so that's a really surprising, scary thing that just in my limited career time down in Antarctica, you've seen such a shift in the penguin population. So, and it's not just because it's too cold or too warm for the penguins now, it's more that their food sources have moved further south or aren't around anymore. So the Gentoos, which eat different things than Adelies, can live there, but the Adelies, it's time for them to find somewhere further south, we hope. So yes, there's definitely shifts.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, it's if I put my science hat on with Viking for a moment, the ability to monitor change, as you say, in your career, seeing these environmental change issues. One of our partners is the not-for-profit Oceanites, who have been monitoring penguins for over 30 years in the peninsula. And as you highlight, the researchers that go down and do the counting are seeing such profound shifts in the population dynamics of different species. If there's a place on Earth that we see rapid change, sadly, is the Antarctic Peninsula of all places. But
yes. And that was actually it was Ron Naveen, the founder of Oceanites, was the person that actually told me about seeing a Gentoo moving in Adelie on. But yeah, and you've got to love the fact that you're taking him down there to continue the work, because that's becoming more and more vital as the seasons roll on and we watch it change.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And indeed, you mentioned Ron Naveen. He's another Viking.TV interviewee and another lawyer turned traveller, I believe. So it's following in his tradition there. It's and with all your travel, I know that many people that might be watching this conversation are considering whether they might travel to the Antarctic. And you, more than almost anyone, would have a broader set of memories to draw upon. Can you share a few highlights of all those travels?
Oh, there's so many. In fact, I've always said that I think most people expect that when they go on their annual vacation, they'll come back with a memory that will last them for the rest of their lives. But in Antarctica, they just come through several times a day. And I've spent lots of days in Antarctica, but if I'm trying to pick things, I've seen an orca family teaching the young orcas to hunt seals on the ice. and the orcas decided they were going to use our zodiacs as decoys, and we were trying to move away and lead them to it, and they were coming with us because they didn't want us to actually interfere with their hunt. Anytime you see an iceberg collapse or a glacial face collapse is a highlight. Of course, Vikings starting to go to South Georgia, and sitting on a beach in South Georgia and having a young elephant seal climb into your lap and go to sleep is something that will stick with me. And being in a big penguin colony, whether it's Nico Harbor in Antarctica or Salisbury Plain in South Georgia, is remarkable. Anytime, any voyage where you see a tabular iceberg, those magnificent icebergs that have come off a frozen a sea, like whether it's coming out of the Weddell Sea or the Ross Sea or wherever, the tabulars are just a remarkable sight.
It sounds like capturing incredible environmental phenomena. And
but I also have to say it's also the people you meet, and the number of people, the number of enduring friendships I've formed from going to Antarctica, finding people who are as curious as I am about Antarctica, and then actually just forming lifelong friendships around that. And because I have been expedition leader, I've been fortunate enough to take some of the world's best photographers to Antarctica and then number them as my friends afterwards. But Damon, we haven't traveled together and we really need to. So there's a photo of me with Franz Lanting, Art Wolf, Tui de Roy, three of the world's great nature photographers, all on my voyage. And likewise, Damon, with your incredible knowledge and enthusiasm, it'd be just a delight if we ever find ourselves on a ship together.
Well, I'm flattered even to be mentioned in the same sentence as the names you've just mentioned, and I think you're not worthy. But as you say, it is the people you meet, and you mentioned earlier in this conversation that you'll be joining us. We're absolutely delighted and honoured that you'll consider sailing with us in voyages to come down south. And I hope everyone that's watching, anyone that's thinking about coming to join us, if you sail with David, you'll have the pleasure of the conversations in the margins of talks and so on, in the same way that in preparation for this conversation, we've had such an interesting conversation. I could go on for hours. I'd love to ask you more, but for the purposes of this chat, may I firstly thank you very much for taking the time to share what is quite clearly some remarkable adventures in your long and distinguished career. So thank you very much, David.
Thanks, Damon, and thanks to Viking too for the opportunity.